and I'm delighted to be here and to talk about two of my more recent projects, which address fossil fuel legacies in two different ways. So I'm going to share my screen now so that I can support what I'm saying with some nice images. So there we go. Yes, so I'm going to be talking, as I say, about these two two works, and I sort of want to create a frame first by talking about fossil fuels and their relation to the Anthropocene. So fossil fuels are an essential component of the extreme influence that Andrew was just talking about of humans on the planet, and they contribute to the Anthropocene in multiple ways. Today I'm going to talk about two artistic responses to this problematic from my practice that address two aspects of anthropic exploitation of fossil fuels, or rather, as they should be named, long carbon reserves. I'll be discussing the legacies of long carbon reserve extraction through the lens of a landscape by discussing my new media artwork, This Land Is Not Mine. And I will talk about the long-term legacy of plastic, long carbon reserves transformed into long-lived materials intended for short-term purposes in my artwork, Stranger to the Trees. Why engage through art with these problems? Inundated with scientific data, reportage, and an overwhelming consensus of not only the phenomena of environmental degradation, but also our part in it, movements to address sustainable development goals continue to progress slower than the rate of damage to the environment. Is this merely our reluctance to act, or rather a state of frozen incapacity to do so? There's an extensive literature exploring such questions, from behaviour change to feminist theory, economics and global systems science. We have arrived at a problem of knowing, where knowing on different levels affects our decision making. While some schemas suggest mostly a cognitive basis for decision making, it's also been shown that emotional response is a key factor in many of the choices that we make, and in particular in relation to climate change and behaviours involving plastics. However, an individual experience is crucial in affecting our behavioural choices, and particularly so in terms of our ability to assess threats. Timothy Morton conceptualises climate change as a hyperobject, which occurs at length scales and time scales greater than that to which we are used to internalise. Indeed, industrialised countries are regularly shielded from the effects of fossil fuel intensive technologies that we have developed for our comfort, such as heating and air conditioning. In terms of climate change, we often lack personal experience of the cycle of cause and effect between our actions and global changes. And this is much the same for pervasive pollution. My artistic practice focuses on political and ecological topics. I've been perplexed by the complex knot of knowledge, behaviour, emotion, spirit and politics that entwine to make both the climate crisis and pervasive pollution wicked problems. When we're not only reluctant to act, but incapable on it, what more do we need to know before we act, and how do we need to know it? It's been argued that in order to tackle wicked problems, we need new narratives to facilitate new forms of collective action. We're at a pivotal moment where collectivity and the means by which it's fostered are in flux. We are navigating dynamics between factors that allow how we relate to others to change, such as the facilitation of relationships between people and objects by digital tools with questionable privacy, and the increased awareness of the importance of non-humans and more than humans, along with changes to what we understand of as the concept of nature. In the context of acting collectively with human, non-human, and more than human others, the demarcation and delineation of the self, as well as the permeability of those boundaries, is particularly pivotal. In my artistic practice, I synthesize learning and knowledge-making practices from multiple disciplines, including chemistry, critical philosophy, and aesthetics, to interrogate various aspects of creating new knowledge and how this affects our relation to others in a complex and fluid ecosystem. Microplastics are small particles of plastic, smaller than 5 millimeters, either created intentionally for industrial purposes or broken down from larger fragments. Microplastics are ubiquitous, anthropogenic materials pervading the environment. Due to plastic's inherent durability, they're expected to accumulate and persist in the environment long term. Microplastics are easily transported in water, air, and soil, and there are approximately 4,900 megatons of plastics, which is 60% of all the plastics ever produced since the 1950s, that enter aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems. It's not surprising then that microplastics have reached the bottom of the Mariana Trench and the top of Mount Everest. The situation is such that the phrase plastisphere has been coined to denote the contemporary pervasive dispersal of artificial plastics around the globe. Designed to be durable and unreactive, plastic outlasts its surrounding flora and fauna, yet ecosystems are adapting to this new materiality, with microorganisms evolving to feed on plastic and plants being shown to take microplastic into tissue. Stranger to the Trees explores how incorporation of plastics into ecosystems challenges how we perceive the boundary between nature and artifice. Stranger to the Trees is a new media project exploring the complementary coexistence of microplastics as echoes of long carbon reserve extraction and trees as carbon sinks. How do trees and microplastics coexist in forests, capturing carbon in the time of the climate crisis? The project combines scientific research into the incorporation of microplastics into tree tissue and the effect of microplastic on tree growth, with aesthetic and embodied research in situ in urban forests, liminal spaces, to create new understandings of the incorporation of the other at different scales of the self, be that trees, ecosystems, or forests. Stranger to the Trees began with an exploration of urban forest environments in Wrocław, Poland, through the European Media Arts Residency Exchange IMAPI Mare programme. Hosted by Row Arts Centre, I began an approach to the question of microplastic coexistence with trees through visits to the Ozebowice forest in the northwest of Wrocław. Taking with me a camera, audio recorder, and a set of instruments adapted to subvert the act of measurement, I carried into the forest on my bike these measuring devices looking for examples of plastic coexisting with trees. I continued this process all along the route between Wrocław and Berlin, where I live, ending at the Berlin Mauerweg, the past location of the Berlin Wall, much of which has been planted with birch trees. Not much is known about how microplastics interact with trees. I began experiments that looked into how trees interact with microplastics of different kinds. And this is an example of the DIY science that Andrew was mentioning in his introduction. Having discussed the methods with scientists to determine how to make them rigorous, I grew birch trees in the presence of soil containing microplastic particles and fibers. I tagged the microplastics with a particular dye using a DIY science method so that they could be easily identified through fluorescence microscopy. In order to grow with the trees and to create a relationality between me and them, not only did I nurture them through their growth, I also began to learn the Renaissance piccolo with them, with which I serenaded them daily. Why birch trees, which were the focus of my researches? In Celtic mythology, birch is seen as trees for new beginnings, paving the way for renewal and purification. Birch is some of the first trees to come into leaf in the spring, and were used as living maypoles to celebrate the new life of spring. The sap rises in the early spring, and in March, the forest of Ozabovica was full of trimmed birch limbs dripping sap into homemade containers for collection. Even now, some gardeners sweep their plots with birch brooms to purify the soil. The symbolism of the birch's power of purification is echoed in the scientific research that shows that birch trees indeed can remediate contaminated land by sequestering and storing industrial pollution in their tissues, which subsequently allows the colonization of microbial communities that break down polyaromatic hydrocarbons and heavy metals. Birch trees rapidly colonize and stabilize disturbed land, allowing for reforestation after disruption. For the purposes of this study, the birch has a dense root system that lies near the soil surface where the concentrations of microplastic pollution has been shown to be the highest. The exploration of in situ forests coexisting with plastic and my own contained experiments informed the aesthetic approaches to the installation of Stranger to the Trees. The installation consists of 2 channels of video. One video draws on the stark abstraction of Lotte Reiniger's silhouette animation to bring the focus onto the coexistence of trees and microplastics as dual agents in forest ecosystems. Mixing silhouette animation with recordings from the forest between Berlin and Wrocław through the seasons. The second film draws from further field recordings and videos from the microscopy of the roots of my experimental birches, searching for fluorescent microplastics within their tissue. These fluorescent microplastics take center stage in the installation of Stranger to the Trees as the lifeblood filling a glass birch tree sculpture, or life sap, one might say. Created from laboratory-grade borosilicate glass and mounted in a steel structure, the sculpture is illuminated by UV light that causes the microplastic containing liquid inside to glow. How audience members interact with the sculpture affects the soundscape of the installation, which includes field recordings of audio from forests and phrases of piccolo composed in the presence of birches. The research from Stranger to the Trees continues, although the sculptural installation is complete. Before midwinter last year, we moved the experimental birches to a site outside Berlin where they can have a permanent home. We continue to monitor their well-being to look at the long-term effect of microplastic exposure in their early lives and to learn more about the reality of this unavoidable coexistence, querying the response of forest ecosystems to the ubiquitous and irrevocable dispersal of this fossil fuel legacy around the Earth. Having exhibited in part in a number of locations around Europe and online, the full installation of Stranger to the Trees will premiere at the Rowe Biennial next month in Wrocław. The other side of the coin is the extraction of fossil fuels or long carbon reserves from the landscape. Humans have related to the land through extractive processes for millennia, be it farming, extracting metals from ore, pulling rocks from the earth for construction, or pulling oil from the seabeds. Since humans settled in the landscape, they have developed increasingly technologically mediated methods to extract resources. However, in these times, when we have passed peak oil, when our consumption of resources is exceeding planetary boundaries, human extractive activity begins to reduce in some areas, while of course increasing in others. Prompted by the rise in electric vehicles, for instance, lithium mining activity has increased by over 1/3 in the last 5 years. At the forefront of these transformations, and the most aesthetically striking, are those landscapes where mines are being decommissioned. These landscapes face significant challenges. The landscapes themselves, shaped by extractive processes, experiencing for decades the chemical repercussions of extractive processes, must undergo remediation and restructuring. All participants in the ecosystem existing in the landscape will undergo adjustments to the new conditions. The human residents of these landscapes must find or rediscover ways to create meaning in the landscape once the mining activity is gone. Historically, this latter quest has led to social and political upheaval, which can have consequences for community cohesion. The quality of these transitions is a vital aspect of approaching sustainable futures. In order to achieve the spirit of the Sustainable Development Goals, we need not only to have technological solutions to meeting society's needs, but also to have the motivation and understanding to work collaboratively and collectively with other humans and with non-humans and more than human community members. Post-extractive landscapes are at the forefront of the transitions that we, as inhabitants of the planet, will face in the next decades as the climate crisis engulfs us. As we stand on the brink of the post-Anthropocene, we must learn new ways to be, new ways to relate to the world and others in it. Where better to experiment with these new modes, but in post-extractive landscapes, which embody on a local scale the implications of anthropogenic disruption to the landscape and ecosystem. Recently, I've become interested in how identity intertwines with extraction to play a role in the evolution of human, more than human landscape relations and challenges for humans to live sustainably. In creating work about this topic, I incorporate not only human perspectives, but what I can glean from non-human perspectives too. The land, the water, the flora and fauna in an ecosystem. I've been exploring this notion of identity in my work, This Land Is Not Mine, an artistic research project carried out over the last year through an artist fellowship at the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies in Potsdam, Germany. This Land Is Not Mine focuses on the region of Lusatia, where Germany, Poland and the Czech Republic meet, and the home of the Sorbian minority group. When it comes to entwining of identity, extraction and sustainability, Lusatia is a particularly interesting place. Alongside being home to the Sorbs, the region is well known for its brown coal mining industry. Indeed, the dominance of the large open cast mines on the landscape is paralleled in their dominance of the narrative of Lusatia's identity. However, this industry is set to end in just under 20 years, and while old mines are already filled with water across the region, questions remain about what will fill the holes left by the mines in the future economy and industry and in people's hearts. This new media project explores identity in this region of coexisting cultures that's undergoing fundamental socioeconomic changes as brown coal mining in the region is phased out. The title of the work, This Land Is Not Mine, which is a hard to translate into German play on words in English that expresses multiple facets of the work. The fact that the mining has been a large part of the regional identity at the expense of other defining characteristics of the region. This land is not only defined by brown coal mines. The fact that human ownership of the land is a collective agreement. This land cannot actually be owned by me. That simultaneously allow us to believe we should and can assert dominance over nature, a mindset that can at times be at odds with sustainability's theoretical underpinnings. And finally, the name addresses my own relationship to the region as an immigrant who grew up near the Welsh border and with Welsh heritage. This land is not where I'm from, but something feels familiar. For This Land Is Not Mine, my first approach was once again through the landscape and entities within it, through sound. Simultaneously, I began to reach out to those humans living within the landscape in an effort to understand and work together to create meaning of living in this transitioning landscape. I set up a crowdsourcing database to create a place where sounds from Lusatian residents could be uploaded. These are sounds that residents identify with the region as giving an identity to the region. As a response to coronavirus restrictions on participatory events, the microsite shares listening and sound recording practices to disseminate field recording as a way of interrogating emotional engagement with characteristics of the landscape that form part of the identity of the region and the listener, and as a method of deepening one's relationship across the border of one's being to the surroundings. During one of the rare liftings of restrictions in the last year, I ran a workshop for This Land Is Not Mine at the Brandenburg Museum of Modern Art in Cottbus in Lusatia, where we explored the soundscape of urban waterways in the context of the project. I also helped plant a forest farm in rural Brandenburg and joined discussion groups and workshops about identity in the region. I worked with a local artist to make a collaborative response happening within Cottbus. Through prolonged visits to diverse parts of the region, I collected a wealth of video and audio recordings that began to take shape as vignettes on the multiple components of the identity of this region. My entry into making sense of this has been through working with the video material. Drawing from chemical and climate sciences approaches to dynamic systems, I developed a framework with 3 lenses by which to understand what I had encountered: steady, dissipative, and multi. The steady state in chemistry refers to a dynamic system in which rates of change in each direction balance out. In visual terms, the images and stories behind them are along the lines of mythical, organic, flowing, and ephemeral. Here you see images from inside the Spray, the river running through Lusatia, in a suburban park, and the lower 2 images are from a region called Schoterbutz, which is the center of a lot of mythology and folklore from times before the national borders were in place. The left lower image refers to Leuchtmus, or phosphorescent moss, which grows in the hills around Kunewald. And the lower right image is of gnats, which form part of a folkloric tradition about money. A dissipative state is one in which there is a constant loss from the system of energy or matter. Visually, this relates to material around the extraction and consumption of long-term carbon reserves. You see here images from a power plant seen over the Cottbuser Ostsee, the name sign for a village about to be destroyed by open-cast mining, traffic lights in Cottbus, and the Autobahn traveling northwest out of Lusatia, following the power lines that lead from the power plants in Lusatia to Berlin, which consumes the energy generated by the region. Finally, a multi-state system in chemistry and the climate sciences is one in which there are multiple possibilities for achieving equilibrium. One can think of this as the possibility of creating new steady states in a post-extractive landscape, modes of coexistence and remediation. The bottom right picture is from a forest farming project in the village of Dissen, the one that I helped to plant. The top right shows an abandoned building being taken over by weeds. And the 2 left-hand images show some degree of curation and coexistence between humans as stewards of the landscape and the needs of the land and water. The videos form lenses which will be presented as 20-channel installation across a 7/6/7 triptych with an interactive soundscape that responds to the positioning of visitors in relation to the vignettes, and therefore in relation to various aspects of Lusatia. The challenge here is to engage fairly with the landscape. The aesthetic of the mining, both in terms of sounds and visuals, is so epic that there is a risk to be engulfed by it. But on a smaller scale, there is a great deal of beauty and variety, accessible through paying close attention, embodiment, and technological mediation that tells a much richer story. This Land Is Not Mine will be shown at the reopening of the Prater Gallery in Berlin and at the Brandenburg Museum of Modern Art in Cottbus in the autumn. Working on both of these projects has helped me address questions that were raised by previous works, where I addressed empathic relations to the consequences of the climate crisis. In these 2 works, I've tried to look to the future with acceptance that humans have wreaked irrevocable changes on the other entities and ecosystems with which we are entwined, and understanding that these other entities and systems are shifting the agency away from humans, and with an aim to understand what some facets of existence in this post-Anthropocene world may look like. Thank you for your attention. I'd like to take the opportunity to thank my many collaborators on the works that I've presented today, with a particular mention of the scientist experts and who engaged with me on Stranger to the Trees, and the funding that has allowed for all of this work to happen from the Creative Europe Culture Programme of the European Union and from the ISS Potsdam Fellowship Programme. Thank you. That's all from me. So I'd be very happy to elaborate on any of these things that I've talked about or answer other questions.
Thanks so much, Kat. I think we can ask questions perhaps either through the chat, or if you want to raise their hand.